Hello, art historians, and welcome to our final lecture for this unit over the art of imperialism. And for this lecture, we're going to move out of Africa and we're going to move across the Atlantic to North America. Now, earlier this year, we already talked about South America and Mesoamerica, but we're now moving into primarily just North America in terms of this second wave of imperialism that came over from Europe. Not just that, hey, Columbus ran into this part of the world, but now we're looking at this deliberate movement of people west across the North American continent and encountering people that were already living here, and that is going to have a major impact on the art, just like we saw in Africa. All right, so just a little bit to help with establishing the context. All right, when we talked about, if you took AP Art History first semester, we talked about Mesoamerica, like Mexico, and we also talked about South America, which were greatly impacted by the Spanish and Portuguese cultures that came over here after Columbus ran into the Americas trying to find his way to India. And that is actually going to be a much quicker takeover than it's going to be in North America, all right? Because the American settlers are going to have to move west. And at certain points, the Europeans, A, were running into Native Americans, and B, North America was also divided up at one point. There was French territories, there was Spanish territories. So it really was going to be quite some time before North America and its art and the Native Americans who lived here were highly impacted all the way across the continent. So a lot of the Native Americans, there's actually been debate on whether or not what happened in North America should be considered a genocide or not, because a great deal of Native Americans were moved into specific areas on reservations. They were given specific areas of land, and a lot of them were slaughtered by the white people who were making their way across, the continent. Now, that's not always the case. There were a lot of situations where the two came to some more favorable agreements, but for the most part, we've heard about things like the Trail of Tears and, the Native American wars that were fought with, the European settlers and, the people who basically were American at this time. So, where does the art play into this? Well, just like we're going to see with Africa, we're going to see artists in the Americas, in North America, who are going to keep their art alive as a way of keeping their culture alive, right? So, we saw this with African art where they're going to continue their art styles and their art ways because it is representative of their culture and who they are, and keeping their culture and not giving in to the way that the outside pressures wanted things to look. It's also going to be a way to keep their culture active, and to make sure that they can almost rebel in a more peaceful way by keeping that culture going. But just like in Africa, we're also going to see works of art in North America that show that combination, that influence from the European and American settlers. So, really, kind of a major thing to look at as you're going through this lecture is how can we compare works of art from North America to those of Africa? That would be a really big study point for you as you're looking through this. So think about it as you hear about these works of art and start going, hey, that kind of sounds like Africa, like this piece of art in Africa. And also think about that continuity and change. All right, so what about this work of art continues the Native American tradition, and what changed as the result of them encountering the Europeans? That would be a really big study skill for this test. So you'll notice here that when we're talking about settlements of Native Americans, you'll hear of kind of this division. So you'll see the Plains Indians. When we talk about the Plains, I at least want you to understand where we're talking about, like the central part of the Americas. And then over here on the left, when we talk about the greater Northwest, I want you to see this part in blue that kind of stretches up into Canada just a little bit. Okay, so just like we saw in Africa, there are going to be situations where Europeans felt that if they could, or Americans even, that if they could squash the art or the ceremonies of the native people, they could kind of crush their spirit or a little bit. They found some of the art and some of the practices that these Native Americans took place in to be almost rebellion, and could be seen as threatening because a lot of these pieces of art were used in ceremonies. Just like in Africa, they were not meant to be just looked at. They weren't just taken out and hung up. They were usually put away and hidden until they were meant to be brought out and used. And you never knew when they were going to be brought out and used. It was kind of like a surprise at the same time. So one of the things that Europeans and Americans would do is they would ban these ceremonies, because they viewed them as rebellion, basically, or they viewed them for other reasons, or they viewed them as anti-Christian, whatever their motive was. And they would also ban, therefore, the art that went with that. So I want to start out by looking at the art of the Pacific Northwest. So what we're going to be looking at for this first piece is what we call the transformation masks of the Pacific Northwest. And the word transformation comes from the fact that these masks transformed. So not only did the mask transform during the ceremony, but they also were meant to symbolically transform or symbolize this transformation of ancestors from their animal spirits into and revealing their ancestor selves. All right, so the people of the Pacific Northwest, so think Pacific Ocean, North and West, so like Seattle, Washington, British Columbia, this area, they believed that the animal spirit was very, very strong, that the ancestors and the people had come to this world as animals. And I hate to even bring this up as a way to kind of understand this, but if you've seen Twilight, oh my gosh, I'm really sorry, but Jacob and the tribe that he's a part of, that they are werewolves and like their spirit is the wolf, and that's in Forks, Washington. All right, so you get it. All right, so it's that animal spirit thing, that these ancestors, when they leave the body, when their soul leaves the body, so just like with other African cultures we looked at, they're very into ancestor worship and animal worship, that their soul would leave the body and become transformed into the animal spirit. And that animal spirit was very reflective of their culture, almost kind of like a crest or a mascot, if you will, for these particular tribes or clans. So these clans, right? So so you would have tribes, and then you would have different groups within it of these clans, would have these different symbols to represent who they were, and these groups would have possession of these masks, and they were usually very well protected by to have one was a very high standing of the person in the tribe or the clan. So what they would do is they would have a ceremony called a potlatch ceremony, and this was a giving festival to honor the ancestors. And the ancestors would come and visit during this to receive these gifts. And because they were transformed into animals upon their death, they would come back as the animals and then reveal themselves. You can see the opening up and then the face revealed, and it would be transformed into this person. All right. So somebody wearing this mask, which would be a man, would be dancing around and then suddenly pull strings, and it would open and reveal the ancestor to the people there. All right. So it's a very important ceremony, this potlatch ceremony. And these transformation masks, you can see this one's pretty elaborate because it opens up and then there's the face on the inside. They believed in animism, and remember, Africans believed in this too, that spirits can animate objects. They can bring them to life. They can inhabit these. So in this case, it's the ancestors. The idea of regeneration of life, right? So like the ancestors kind of coming back, right? And again, that idea of, fertility and the ancestors stepping in and making sure everything was going okay. And then human animal transformation is a very big part of that. The ancestors come down from the sky, remove their animal or bird skin to reveal themselves to the people. So these are very similar in the fact that you can see that they are very stylized, right? But at the same time, they are very simple because it's about an idea, not necessarily an exact representation. You have open eyes, you have these power colors of reds and blacks and whites, which are the primary ones. And it's almost like the markings on them represent like a family crest, like it's their colors, it's their symbol, all right? And meant to kind of show like the ancestors possessed this quality of this animal, whether it's strength or like thunderbirds, the ability to bring rain and lightning. So kind of showing power in that way. So for the 250, they call it the Quack Walk. Get it? Quack Walk transformation mask. All right. So that's one of these Pacific Northwest tribal groups. And there would be creatures for these of the four cosmos. So they even recognize that the universe was divided up into the sky, the sea, the mortal world and the spirit world. So these could represent that. So you would have birds, you would have bears, you would have all of these, different animals that spoke to that particular tribe. And they were usually made out of red cedar wood, which is available in that part of the country. And then you would notice that there are strings running through it because that's what they would pull to reveal the mask on the inside. Kind of interesting, just to show you guys this, I'll go ahead and show you that if you've heard of the football team, the Seattle Seahawks, all right, so who are on the Pacific West Coast, the Seattle Seahawks were actually inspired for their logo by the Quack Walk transformation mask, which is a Seahawk, all right? So you're looking here at like basically the exterior of this. They're paying tribute to the groups who are in that culture. Now, where does this show interaction with the Europeans? Because these don't physically show that they were impacted by the Europeans, but they were impacted because the Americans who took over this territory, the white people, banned the potlatch ceremony, which is when these masks would have been worn because the ceremonies were to honor ancestors. So during those potlatch ceremonies, nobody would work. And the Europeans, who had basically forced these natives into labor, banned the potlatch because people wouldn't work during that time. And they would use religious excuses. They said, we can't allow them to do this. They're doing cannibalism during these, ceremonies, which was not true. But they banned the potlatch because it actually shut down work during this ceremony, and they needed these Native Americans to work. So you can see how Europeans are going to kind of ban or take these and see them as a threat against themselves. So another instance of this, of interaction with the Europeans, is going to be with the Shoshone tribe, who are actually in the plains area. So remember I showed you guys kind of like in the middle, so like Wyoming, Dakotas, that kind of area. And dancing is a huge part of, just like with the African cultures, it's a major part of Native Americans. And these dances weren't just to dance and hop around. These dances were very ceremonial. They had huge purpose. They were meant to honor things or to almost pray for things, chant for things. They could be for preparation for battle. They could be celebrations of marriages, all kinds of things. So the sun dance for the Shoshone people of the plains was an extremely important ceremony that they would do. And it would take place during the summer solstice, all right? And it would last like 4 to 8 days. Like these dances were not just a one-time dance for one song. Like it was a dance to do something, to accomplish something, right? Meanwhile, Europeans are just hopping around to like fiddle music. But these guys, if they danced with the drums and everything, there was an entire message to it. So it was almost like a cycle through this dance, all right? That it was the beginning and the end, and the steps of it were to kind of bring the regeneration of life. So like summer is when things grow. It's when, things, spring and summer, things are being born. And usually they would do this dance at the same time as the buffalo hunt season, because to them, the buffalo was life. So if this is all about the cycle of life, the buffalo were life. They lived off the buffalo. They used every single part of it, even the tongue, the internal organs. None of it was wasted. The buffalo was life. So there would be this, coincision of this with the buffalo hunt, right? And in 1804, Canadians and Americans, and this was not the only dance that they banned, they did other ones like the ghost dance as well. They declared this as illegal because they saw it. The Europeans saw this and the Americans saw this as a threat. Like they were getting geared up to go to fight. They were getting ready to gear up and go to war. They were almost like flexing on the Europeans, basically. So we have an artist here named Kadzi Cody, all right, that wasn't his name. His name was Castiogo, all right, but the Americans gave him the name Kadzi Cody, which is just a little bit more, I guess, American on their part, right? And here he is, you can see him. And Kadzi Cody was moved onto a reservation in Wyoming, him and his people and the Shoshone. And he's originally, when he would create his original works of art to like remember the culture and remember their tradition so that they didn't forget in the middle of this takeover, Originally, he would have painted his works of art on buffalo, right? And it would have been done with natural based paints and pigments that he would have had access to, right? But the Europeans had killed off the buffalo, and people would come out to the plains to get a chance to go on an authentic buffalo hunt with the natives, which of course wasn't authentic at all because the Native Americans didn't use guns, they used bows and arrows. But the buffalo, or the Europeans would come out and hunt the buffalo and just leave it. It was just for sport. And they had basically wiped out the buffalo. And those that hadn't been wiped out were displaced by the railroads that they were building. So he didn't have buffalo skin to do this on anymore. And the more he encountered Europeans, the more he started using their paints because there was such a high demand for Native American works of art. All right. So he actually, as a way to make money and to preserve his culture at the same time, started creating these hide paintings. All right. So he would use elk hide because elk was still available. The buffalo were gone. So it wasn't exactly the same thing. And he would paint these different scenes that he could remember from his tribe as a way to keep that culture alive, but at the same time also survive in this new world that was run by the white man. So these works of art that you can see here are called hide paintings. So they're from elk hide, not buffalo. And you can see here that he's showing the buffalo hunt, but he's showing the buffalo hunt with bows and arrows. So he's kind of remembering that other time, but it's ironic because the buffalo are all gone because of the Europeans. Like they had basically wiped them all out. You can see them laying here. And then you can see on the left one, it is the sun dance. And they're dancing in the middle of the teepees and they're surrounded by the buffalo. And he's using now much more synthetic paints. He's using man-made paints instead of like the natural ochres. You can see these paints are much more vibrant and bright and like crayonish because that's what the Europeans had and it was easier to use and not have to mix it. So basically he's got a couple purposes with Kadzi Cody doing these. It's to remember his culture and almost slap in the face, with what he was painting the Europeans. Like, okay, you didn't let us do the sun dance, but I'm going to paint the sun dance. And I'm going to show you what it was for, which was for the buffalo, who, by the way, you guys wiped out. And I can't even do this on buffalo. I have to do it on elk because you guys have wiped out the buffalo. So it's not even really authentic. All right. So if you want a Native American artifact, here you go. It's your paint and it's elk and not buffalo. So you don't actually get it, but it looks like you are, and it's keeping our culture alive. Okay, so the one for the 250 that they've given you guys is the Great Elk Hide painting of the sun dance, right? Which was illegal, but he's like, well, fine, you can ban it, but I'm still gonna paint about it. Here it is. This is our sun dance. I'm keeping the memory alive. It shows the bison hunt or the buffalo, and you can see the buffalo all around it. You can see like the buffalo are very, very detailed, and it's very active. Like the lines are very moving, so you can kind of like guide your eye. Like it's a very dynamic scene. And then in the middle of it is the sun dance, which is what this was for. And the teepees in the center of it, right? Okay, are kind of aimed to the sky, and they would have been facing towards the east to greet the sun because this is for the sun dance. And notice that there aren't guns. It's bows and arrows, right? To kind of show that that's what this was actually for. So yeah, you could buy this as a European, that's fine. But really, it's to keep our culture alive in a way that you tried to ban. And it's not even truly authentic as being Native American because I'm using European paints and elk hide. So basically the Europeans kind of got ripped off. All right, so his works of art became more fit to selling to the white people because that could actually be money making for his people because they had been forced to have to rely on making money to fit into this new economy to survive. So it's no longer these natural paints, it's these commercial oil paints.
Mom, but I can't hear it. But I can't hear it.
Okay, sorry about that. My daughter is home at the same time. Okay, so he is not going to be the only person who is going to cater to the European market as a way to survive because it just makes me nauseous that a lot of these white people who were coming in and these settlers moving across the West who were doing these terrible, horrible things to these native people and forcing them to live on reservations were also wanting to buy or collect Native American artifacts, almost like a way to, say, hey, they're going to be gone soon, so we might as well collect some of their native stuff. And I really like how Kadzi Cody kind of got back at him a little bit, like being, oh yeah, you got an authentic Native American thing when the only thing authentic about it is really the scene of something that you guys stopped and killed. So good job. So a lot of Native American artists are going to find that they could make a lot of money by selling their works of art, which to them weren't works of art. They were actually functional, but Europeans saw these as, works of art to be collected. And another culture that's going to do this is the Delaware people. And the Delaware people, if you know where Delaware is located, were one of the first groups to encounter the Europeans whenever they arrived here, before they were eventually pushed west and kind of settled in Kansas. So the work of art we're going to look at was most likely made in Kansas by the Delaware people who got pushed that far west before settling onto a reservation. So Native Americans, before the Europeans showed up, had what was called these bandolier bags that you're seeing over here on the right. And these bandolier bags were a huge sign of status to have these as being a warrior or reaching manhood. And before the Europeans showed up, these were to decorate a human, right? They were made by women. So most arts in the Native American world were made by women, and women had high status for doing this, but they were worn by men as kind of like a badge of honor. Like it wasn't just something to be like, oh, doesn't this look pretty or fashionable? It was a sign of a warrior, a sign of strength, because these took so long to make. Everything that you're looking at on here would have originally been made by porcupine quills on like buckskin leather. So like deer leather with porcupine quills in different colors that would create these really intricate patterns. But Europeans, when they showed up, and white settlers thought that these were beautiful and really liked them as collector's items and started using them for storing ammunition in the pouches because they had guns. So therefore, this was a convenient place for them to store their ammunition for their weapons. So this is an example of a bandolier bag. You can see it's kind of draped over it, and it is such an honor to have one of these because the patterns are so intricate and they take so long to make, and the beads are so tiny. And yes, I said beads, all right? And I'll explain that in a second. These were ceremonial to kind of show like coming of age and manhood, like because they were so painstaking to make. It was such a high status item. And eventually what's going to happen when the Europeans show up is the Europeans are going to bring with them beads, like glass beads. All right. So just like we saw with the elephant mask in Africa, Native Americans of the Delaware group or Delaware tribe actually started using beads to create these bandolier bags instead. So here you can see like a man of status who has 2 bandolier bags actually. And these weren't used to hold anything. They were used later by the Europeans to hold their ammunition in. All right. The only thing that I can do to think of this is, and I don't know why this is, but if anybody sees The Office and when Jim got Pam the teapot for Christmas that she really wanted, and if you haven't seen The Office, I'm sorry, but Jim gets this girl he really likes, this teapot that she wants, and he fills it with all these very special gifts. Like it's a very painstaking gift that he worked so hard to put together, and it ends up in the hands of the guy that he hates the most, Dwight. And Dwight is actually going to use it as a way to flush out his nasal passages, and Jim is just disgusted to be like, oh my god, this thing that I put so much effort into that had so much meaning is now being used for that. All right. That's kind of how I imagine the Native Americans looked at these were so special and so painstaking to create, because everything you're looking at here, every bit of that blue, every bit of that red, every bit of the white, all the patterning is done in the tiniest little beads that you've ever seen to create these things of like, and they had symbolic meaning too, like sky and earth, All right, there was so much meaning to these, and to be worn as like decoration of an esteemed man. They would have bells on them that would make noise because they obviously weren't used for hunting if they have bells on them. And here the Europeans come in and start wanting these, and the women would make them because it'd be a way for them to make something they could trade or make a living off of. But women who could make these were very highly revered and did the work to make these. And then Europeans came in and they started adapting to make these using European style beads. Now, another example of a situation where the women, so remember, we've seen so many places, it took us so long in Europe just to see a female artist start to get recognition. But in the Americas and in Africa, women were of such higher importance, especially in the creation of these works of art. They were honored for the artwork that they were doing. And a really good example of that is in the Anasazi people in like the New Mexico area. And we've actually already talked about this area earlier in the year when we talked about the Mesa Verde cliff dwellings, the Pueblo cliff dwellings that are out towards New Mexico, Wyoming, that particular area. So when these people, the Anasazi, had actually been one of the first people in this area to start farming, and as a result of that, they had a very long tradition of creating ceramic or clay pottery to hold their crops in, to hold their water in. And when the Europeans showed up, all right, traditional pots had been replaced by modern pottery that was arriving on railroads. So instead of being like this well handcrafted pottery, it was being replaced by manufactured vessels to hold things in. So basically, that entire craft that had been in this culture for generations was going away. And it was a huge, like, pottery to these people was not something that just one person did. Everybody did it because it was meant to help everyone. And the more people that knew the skill, the more potters you had. It wasn't this elite artistic thing like we saw in Europe. And women would pass this skill down to multiple generations. And it was dying. It was going away because of the railroads coming in and all this modern stuff replacing this cultural past. So you can see the Anasazi are right in this area, and you can see the Mesa Verde right here in Colorado, New Mexico area. So the artist we're going to look at is Maria Montoya Martinez. And this woman just seems like incredible. I really wish I could have, met her just because she seems so incredible. So Maria Martinez and her husband Julian were Anasazi. They were of the ancestral Pueblo, so they were Native American in lineage. And living in this area, they had established a dynasty of potters that were familial and non-familial. So meaning people who were in her family, but also people that weren't in her family. She had established this legacy of teaching people how to revive this pottery technique that was dying out as a way to keep their culture alive, right? So the pottery was basically a representation of them keeping their culture alive. Plus, there was such a high demand for it because it was so special. It was a way for them to make money and survive. And Maria Martinez had this hand coiling technique to create her pots. All right, so she didn't do it on a wheel. She hand coiled them and then smoothed them. And what she found a way to do is turn the red clay pottery this brilliant black, right? And then polish it to this beautiful shine. And then her husband, Julian, would paint the designs on the side. This really reminds me of Coco, if you've seen the Disney movie Coco, like where the family shoemaking business was part of their, family. And this was something that was here. And even if you married into the family, you could learn how to do it. So they called this the black on black ware, all right? Or Maria ware pottery. And it was one of the crazy things is her husband actually, in desperation for a job, actually got a job cleaning in a museum. And using those trips to the museum, that's where they got a chance to look at this ancient pottery and really revive it as much as they possibly could. So people having this big demand for native works of art, even though this wasn't like an antique, it was being made now, it had that native look to it with these geometric patterns and these beautiful shapes and this rare way of turning red clay pottery into black pottery without a kiln. Like they weren't putting it in an oven to do it, which is even more incredible. So this is what Maria ware looks like, Maria Martinez. And you can see it's got that beautiful black polish to it. And then on the outside is the designs that her husband Julian would paint. And she taught everybody how to do this, but because her name had become so popular with it, she would sign her name on everybody's pottery so that people would buy it. She wouldn't take the money for it, but they would buy it because it was a Maria Martinez, kind of like saying it's a Kate Spade or it's a Hugo Boss. All right, this is a Maria Martinez. And even though she probably didn't even make it, she just showed somebody else how to do it so that they could get the money from it. So Maria Martinez was just incredible. I mean, she was invited to the White House, I found out, by four different presidents. She was given honorary degrees at, I believe, the University of Colorado and a couple others, even though she never went to those schools. And she helped to elevate pottery to an art form in America. Because think about it, we've seen pottery all over Europe. That's no big deal. Even from the beginning of, human history, we've seen it. But in America, it just wasn't that big of a deal. This is when pottery kind of became a very big deal of Native American pottery in the Americas. And she kept the ancestral Pueblo and the Anasazi tradition alive. Like they didn't forget their culture and their background. They actually survived by doing something from their past. And when she was born, pottery making wasn't really necessary because the Europeans and the Americans had, kind of established their own ways of storing things. But she did revive this and made it a true art form in the Americas. And in 1904, I just think it's kind of cool, she displayed her pottery at the St. Louis World's Fair, which is kind of cool. So her technique, this black on black, is she would put on a fire, she would put cow poop or manure on the fire. And from that smoke, it would come out and it would turn this red. So for everybody who's like, oh my gosh, this is such fancy pottery. Yeah, but it's made by smoking cow poop. So anyway, it would turn the red clay black. So even though they're not using these expensive kilns or ovens, they're able to create this black pottery that nobody else really knew how to do. And because America was going through Art Nouveau and Art Deco, which is where they like to decorate entire rooms or buildings in a particular theme, like Native American, it was very, very popular and made its way all over the country as a result. So here she is, creating her, even in her older age, creating this beautiful pottery that her husband would paint the designs onto. All right, so we are now finished with the art of imperialism.